Every mother knows the fierce love that would move mountains to protect her children. Every woman who has faced betrayal understands the quiet strength that grows in the darkness of abandonment. Young Alvi learned both lessons on the night she was thrown to the wolves by the man who promised to marry her. Jarl Einar cast her into the winter wilderness, expecting the cold to finish what his cruelty started. But 20 years later, Alvi returned to his gates. She brought her 3 warrior sons and her giant husband, Bjorn Ironshoulder. The frightened girl was gone, replaced by a woman forged by survival and love. What happens when a mother's protection meets a betrayer's reckoning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 20 winters passed, when the world seemed smaller and hope burned brighter in young hearts. Alvi Eiríksdóttir had believed in promises. She had believed in the warmth of a hearth shared with love, in the strength of a man's word given before witnesses, and in the simple dream of raising children who would know their father's name with pride. The village of Ravenshollow nestled between towering pine forests and the ice-cold waters of Mjolnir Fjord, where the morning mist danced like spirits among the wooden longhouses. Each structure told a story of survival against the harsh northern elements: thick timber walls chinked with moss and mud, steep-pitched roofs designed to shed the heavy snows, and smoke holes that sent grey ribbons skyward like prayers to the old gods. The scent of wood smoke, salt air, and the earthy richness of the surrounding forests created an atmosphere that spoke of permanence, of families who had weathered countless seasons in this remote corner of the world. At the heart of Ravenshollow stood Jarl Einar's great hall, a structure that dominated the landscape with its imposing presence. Carved dragon heads crowned the peaked ends of the roof, their wooden eyes seeming to watch over the village with ancient authority. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands forged by the village smiths, opened onto a hall where flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows across tapestries that depicted the heroic deeds of Einar's ancestors. Here, among the carved pillars and long wooden tables, the Jarl held court and dispensed what he called justice to his people. Einar Bloodaxe, though he had never earned that epithet through any feat worthy of saga, commanded respect through fear rather than honor. A man of middle years with graying hair braided with silver rings, he possessed the kind of presence that filled a room and demanded attention. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter ice, missed nothing that transpired within his domain. Those eyes had fixed upon young Alvi with an intensity that should have warned her family of the storm to come. The silver drinking horn that never left his side served as both symbol and tool of his authority. Carved with intricate knotwork and inlaid with precious metals traded from distant lands, it represented the wealth and power he had accumulated through years of careful manipulation and ruthless decision-making. When Einar drank from that horn, men listened. When he set it down with deliberate force upon the oak table, discussions ended. Alvi's father, Eric the shipwright, had built half the vessels that carried Ravenshollow's fishermen to sea each dawn. His hands, permanently stained with tar and scarred from countless days, working with adze and axe, had shaped the elegant curves of hulls that could ride the fjord's treacherous waters with grace. Eric was a practical man who valued honest work and measured success by the seaworthiness of his craft. When Jarl Einar approached him about a marriage between his daughter and the Jarl's nephew, Magnus, Eric saw opportunity wrapped in tradition. A good match, Eric had told his wife, Astrid, as they discussed the proposal beside their own modest hearth. Magnus is young, strong, and Einar speaks well of his character. Alvi could do far worse than marrying into the Jarl's family. Astrid, whose gentle wisdom had guided their household through lean winters and abundant summers alike, had watched her daughter carefully during the courtship. She saw how Alvi's eyes brightened when Magnus visited, how the girl's laughter rang true when he told stories of his travels to other settlements along the coast. There seemed to be genuine affection growing between the young people, and Astrid allowed herself to hope that her daughter would find the happiness that had blessed her own marriage to Eric. Alvi herself had embraced the possibility of love with the pure heart of youth. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that drew appreciative glances without vanity, auburn hair that caught firelight like burnished copper, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a smile that seemed to illuminate whatever space she occupied. More importantly, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman raised to understand her worth without arrogance. Magnus appeared to be everything a young woman could desire in a husband, tall and broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of a man who had never known want. He courted Alvi with genuine attention and respect. He brought her small gifts, a comb carved from whalebone, a brooch worked in silver, wildflowers gathered from the high meadows, and listened with apparent interest when she spoke of her dreams and fears. Their conversations often stretched long into the evening, watched over by Astrid's approving eyes and Eric's satisfied nods. The betrothal ceremony had taken place on the first day of summer, when the sun lingered long in the northern sky, and the village celebrated with feasting and music that echoed across the fjord. Alvi wore her mother's best dress, dyed the deep blue of a summer twilight, and embroidered with threads of gold that had cost Eric a season's finest work. Magnus placed the traditional arm ring upon her wrist, speaking the ancient words that bound them in the eyes of gods and men. Jarl Einar himself blessed the union, raising his silver horn high as the assembled villagers cheered their approval. "May this marriage bring strength to both our houses," Einar had proclaimed, his voice carrying across the crowd with practiced authority. "May the gods smile upon this union and grant it the blessing of many sons." Through the long summer months that followed, as preparations for the autumn wedding proceeded with careful attention to every detail, Alvi found herself caught between anticipation and an unease she could not name. Magnus remained attentive and kind, yet sometimes she caught glimpses of something darker in his uncle's pale eyes when they rested upon her. Jarl Einar's interest in the match seemed to go beyond mere family affection, though she could not understand why her marriage should matter so greatly to a man of his standing. The other women of the village, led by Ingrid the Weaver and old Helga, who knew every secret that had ever been whispered in Raven's Shallow, worked tirelessly to prepare everything a new bride would need. They wove cloth for bedding and clothing, prepared the special foods that would grace the wedding feast, and shared the ancient wisdom that mothers passed to daughters about the mysteries of marriage and motherhood. "A woman's strength lies not in her sword arm," Helga had counselled during one of their gathering sessions, her weathered hands never pausing in their spinning as she spoke. "It lies in her ability to endure, to bend without breaking, and to find ways to thrive even when the seasons turn harsh. Remember this, child, for life has a way of testing us when we least expect it." The wedding dress that would become both blessing and curse hung in Astrid's weaving room throughout those final weeks, a creation of stunning beauty that represented months of careful work. Made from the finest wool dyed crimson as fresh blood, it featured intricate embroidery that told the story of the bride's family line in threads of silver and gold. The tortoise brooches that would fasten the overdress had been worn by Eric's mother and grandmother before her, connecting Alvi to generations of women who had faced their own challenges with courage and grace. As the autumn equinox approached and the wedding day drew near, the entire village hummed with excitement and preparation. The great hall underwent cleaning that reached every corner and crevice, while the kitchen fires burned day and night to prepare the massive feast that would mark the celebration. Barrels of mead and ale arrived from neighboring settlements, along with merchants bearing exotic spices and luxuries that would make this wedding a memory to treasure for years to come. Yet beneath the surface, joy, currents of tension flowed that only the most observant noticed. Jarl Einar's mood had grown increasingly unpredictable as the wedding approached, swinging between periods of jovial approval and moments of cold silence that seemed to freeze the very air around him. Magnus, too, seemed troubled by something he would not share, though he continued to treat Alvi with unfailing courtesy and apparent affection. The night before the wedding, as Alvi sat with her mother making final adjustments to the ceremonial dress, Astrid paused in her sewing to study her daughter's face with worried eyes. "Are you happy, my dear one?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the hearth fire. "Truly happy with this choice we have made?" Alvi considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns embroidered along the dress's hem. "I believe I could learn to love him deeply," she answered honestly. "Magnus is kind to me, mother, and he speaks of our future with such hope. I think we could build a good life together, blessed with children and contentment." Astrid nodded, though the worry did not leave her eyes entirely. "Marriage is a partnership that requires constant tending, like a garden that must be watered and weeded to flourish. Remember that love grows strongest, not in the bright moments of passion, but in the quiet times, when two people choose each day to stand together against whatever storms may come." As mother and daughter sat together in the warm circle of firelight, neither could imagine that by the following sunset, everything they held dear would be shattered beyond recognition. The wedding dress hanging between them would soon be stained with tears and blood, and the dreams they wove with such careful hope would unravel like poorly spun thread in the harsh winds of betrayal. Outside, the first winter storm of the season began to build beyond the mountains, bringing with it changes that would transform not only Alvi's fate, but the destiny of everyone she loved. The wedding day dawned grey and bitter, with snow falling in thick curtains that muffled the sounds of the village's final preparations. Alvi woke in her family's longhouse to the gentle touch of her mother's hand upon her shoulder, the familiar warmth of the hearth fire, and the devastating knowledge that this would be her last morning in the home where she had grown from child to woman. "Come, dear one," Astrid whispered, her voice thick with emotion she struggled to contain. "The women are here to help you prepare." The ritual of dressing a bride had been performed countless times in Ravenshollow, yet today it carried a weight that seemed to press down upon everyone involved. Ingrid the weaver and old Helga worked in unusual silence, their normally chattering voices subdued as they helped Alvi into the ceremonial garments. The crimson wedding dress, so beautiful in the firelight of previous evenings, seemed to absorb the grey morning light and transform it into something ominous. As tradition demanded, Alvi's hair was braided with ribbons of gold and silver, while the ancient tortoise brooches, symbols of femininity and fertility passed down through generations of her family, were pinned to secure the overdress. Each element of her attire carried symbolic meaning, the colours representing the blood that would seal the marriage bond, the metals symbolizing prosperity and permanence, the intricate patterns woven into the fabric telling the story of her lineage. Magnus arrived at mid-morning with a small escort of his uncle's warriors, their presence lending formality to what should have been a joyous occasion. He looked handsome in his own ceremonial dress, a tunic of deep blue wool bordered with silver thread, his best sword hanging at his side, and the golden arm-ring that marked his status as nephew to the Jarl gleaming upon his wrist. Yet something in his bearing suggested a man walking toward duty rather than delight. "You are beautiful beyond words," he told Alvi when they met in the doorway of her family's home, but his eyes did not quite meet hers as he spoke the traditional greeting. "Are you ready to become my wife and join your fate to mine?" The ceremony itself took place in the great hall, where the villagers had gathered despite the worsening weather. Jarl Einar presided with his usual authority, the silver drinking horn prominent on the high table beside him as symbol of his power to bind lives and destinies with his words. The ancient rituals proceeded according to custom. the exchange of swords symbolizing the transfer of protection from father to husband, the sharing of mead from the ceremonial cup, the speaking of vows that had been spoken by countless couples throughout the generations. It was during the feast that followed, as the villagers raised their voices in songs of celebration and the mead flowed freely among the gathered tables, that the first shadow fell across the day. A messenger arrived from the coastal settlements, his horse foam-flecked from hard riding despite the treacherous conditions. The man bore urgent news that required private counsel with the Jarl, and Einar withdrew with his closest advisors to hear what intelligence could not wait for a more appropriate time. When Einar returned to the hall, his face had transformed into a mask of cold fury that silenced the celebration as effectively as a shout. The silver drinking horn trembled in his grip as he took his place at the high table, his pale eyes surveying the assembled crowd with an intensity that made even his bravest warriors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We have received troubling news," Einar announced, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like the edge of a blade. "It seems there are those among us who would mock the sacred bonds of marriage with deception and dishonor." The words fell upon the gathering like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of confusion and unease throughout the hall. Alvi felt her new husband's hand tighten upon hers, his fingers cold despite the warmth from the great hearth fires. Around them, friends and family who had been laughing and singing moments before now watched with growing alarm as their Jarl's mood darkened visibly. "Stand before me, Alvi Eriksdottir," Einar commanded, his voice echoing from the carved rafters overhead. "Stand before your people and account for your conduct." The iron shackles appeared as if from nowhere, carried by two of Einar's most trusted warriors, who flanked Alvi as she rose on trembling legs. The cold metal felt like the touch of death itself as they fastened the chains around her wrists, the weight of them both physical and symbolic of the doom that was closing around her like a trap. "I accuse you," Einar continued, his words falling like hammer blows upon an anvil, "of carrying a bastard child conceived in adultery and deceit. I accuse you of attempting to pass another man's seed off as the legitimate heir of my nephew. I accuse you of bringing shame and dishonor upon both our houses through your wanton conduct." The accusation struck Alvi like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and setting her ears ringing with the impossibility of what she was hearing. Around her, the wedding guests erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps of disbelief. Her mother's cry of denial rose above the din, while her father's voice demanded proof of such devastating claims. "The proof lies in the timing of events," Einar replied with cold calculation, producing a scroll bearing what appeared to be calculations and testimonies. "The child she carries was conceived before any legitimate union could have taken place. The merchant Thorvald has testified to seeing her in compromising circumstances with a traveling trader who passed through our village 3 moons ago. The evidence is clear and damning." "This is madness," Alvi found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper through lips numb with shock. "I swear by all the gods that I am innocent of these charges. I have known no man's touch, and I carry no child within my womb. This is some terrible mistake or malicious lie designed to destroy me." But Einar's mind appeared already made up, his pale eyes showing no mercy as he pronounced judgment upon her. "The evidence speaks louder than protestations of innocence. By the authority vested in me as Jarl of this settlement, I declare this marriage void and this woman guilty of the crimes for which she stands accused. She will be stripped of all possessions and cast out into the wilderness, where the gods may judge whether she lives or dies according to her true merit." Magnus, who should have been her protector and defender, remained silent throughout the proceedings. When Alvi turned to him with desperate eyes, seeking some sign of support or belief in her innocence, she found only a man who would not meet her gaze. Whether he believed his uncle's accusations or simply lacked the courage to oppose them, She could not tell, but his silence struck her as deeply as any physical blow. The iron shackles were removed only long enough to strip away the beautiful wedding dress, leaving Alvi clothed in nothing but a simple shift that would provide little protection against the elements. The crimson fabric, so carefully crafted with love and hope, lay crumpled on the floor where it fell, stained now with tears and bearing witness to the destruction of everything she had believed her life would become. Her family's desperate pleas for mercy fell upon ears that had already closed against compassion. Eric's offer to pay any fine or compensation was rejected with contempt, while Astrid's tears and protestations of her daughter's innocence were dismissed as the natural blindness of a mother's love. Old Helga's voice rose above the others, calling down curses upon those who would destroy an innocent girl. But even her words carried no weight against Einar's determined cruelty. As the great doors of the hall swung open to reveal the howling storm beyond, Alvi was pushed forward into a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. The snow drove against her barely covered skin like needles of ice, while the wind seemed determined to steal what little warmth remained in her trembling body. Behind her, she could hear her mother's wailing and her father's continued protests, but those sounds quickly faded as she was forced beyond the village boundaries into the darkness of the winter night. The last thing Alvi saw before the storm swallowed her completely was the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of homes where families sat safe beside their hearth fires, and the last thing she heard was the howling of wolves in the distance, calling to one another across the frozen wasteland where she had been sent to die. Death came slowly in the northern wilderness, and Alvi learned its patient rhythm during the 3 days she wandered through forests that seemed designed to swallow human life without trace. Her feet, protected only by soft leather shoes meant for dancing rather than survival, had long since lost feeling in the snow that reached past her knees. The thin shift that was her only covering had frozen stiff against her skin, creating a shell of ice that cracked with every movement. On the morning of the 4th day, when her strength had finally abandoned her and she collapsed beside a frozen stream, Alvi made peace with the fact that she would not see another sunrise. She closed her eyes against the falling snow and began to whisper the prayers her mother had taught her, asking the gods to watch over her family and perhaps to grant her a swifter death than the slow freezing that was claiming her inch by inch. That was when the wolves found her. She heard them before she saw them, the soft padding of paws through snow, the almost inaudible communication that passed between pack members as they circled their prey. When she opened her eyes, she found herself surrounded by grey shapes that seemed to materialize from the winter landscape like spirits of the forest itself. Their yellow eyes watched her with the patient intelligence of predators who knew their quarry could no longer flee. Strangely, Alvi felt no fear as she waited for them to close the final distance. After days of suffering, the quick death promised by their fangs seemed almost merciful compared to the slow agony of freezing. She closed her eyes again and waited for the end to come. Instead, she heard the whistle of a blade cutting air, followed by a wolf's startled yelp and the sound of running paws retreating through the underbrush. When she opened her eyes again, a man stood between her and the pack, holding a battle-worn axe that caught the pale morning light along its gleaming edge. The weapon spoke of countless fights survived and victories hard won, its handle worn smooth by hands that knew their work. The man himself appeared to have been carved from the mountains themselves. Taller than any warrior she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of the world, he stood like an ancient oak that had weathered every storm the gods could send. His hair and beard streaked with premature silver despite his relatively young face. Framed features that spoke of Norse heritage, refined by years of solitude and reflection. "The wolves will not take you today," he said simply, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that needed no shouting to command attention. "But if you stay here much longer, the cold will finish what they started." He scooped her into his arms as easily as if she weighed no more than a child, cradling her frozen form against the warmth of his massive chest. Through the fog of exhaustion and cold, Alvi caught glimpses of her rescuer's face, weathered by wind and sun, marked by old scars that spoke of violence survived, yet somehow gentle in its expression. His pale blue eyes, so different from Einar's calculating coldness, held depths of wisdom and sadness that suggested a man who understood suffering intimately. The journey to his dwelling passed like fragments of a fever dream. Alvi drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of movement through snow-laden pines, the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, and the steady rhythm of her rescuer's breathing. When awareness returned fully, she found herself lying on soft furs beside a crackling fire in a simple but well-built shelter that seemed to grow from the forest itself. "You are safe here," the giant assured her as he ladled warm broth from a pot hanging over the flames. "My name is Bjorn Ironshoulder, and I give you my protection for as long as you have need of it." The name meant nothing to her, but the sincerity in his voice carried more weight than all of Jarl Einar's proclaimed authority. As warmth slowly returned to her frozen limbs, accompanied by pain that made her gasp and clench her teeth, Bjorn tended her with the patient care of a man who understood the body's needs and limitations. He said nothing about her circumstances or how she had come to be dying in his forest, asking no questions that might force her to relive recent trauma. His dwelling reflected the man himself, solid, practical, and built to last. The single room combined sleeping area, workshop, and kitchen with an efficiency born of years spent alone. Tools hung neatly from pegs driven into the log walls, while shelves held an impressive array of preserved foods, healing herbs, and the few possessions a man might need for comfortable solitude. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency achieved through skill rather than wealth. Over the following days, as Alvi slowly recovered her strength, she learned something of her rescuer's history through careful observation and the few stories he shared beside the evening fire. Bjorn had once been a warrior of some renown, though he spoke little of those days except to mention battles fought in service of jarls whose names were now forgotten. Some great disappointment or tragedy had driven him to seek the peace of the deep forest, where he had lived alone for more than a decade. "Men disappoint," he said one evening when she asked why he had chosen exile from the world of settlements and politics. "They promise honor and deliver betrayal. They speak of justice while practicing cruelty. I found more honesty in the wolves and bears than in the halls of supposedly great leaders." His bitterness carried no anger, only the weary sadness of a man who had learned hard truths about human nature, yet his actions toward Alvi showed none of the cynicism his words might suggest. He treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, asking nothing in return for his protection except that she regain her health and determine her own path forward. As winter deepened around their refuge, Alvi found herself caught between gratitude for her salvation and uncertainty about the future. She had no family to return to. Einar's sentence of exile made that impossible, and no skills that would allow her to survive alone in the world beyond Bjorn's forest sanctuary. More troubling still, she had begun to suspect that Einar's false accusations might become reality, as her body showed signs that suggested new life growing within her womb. The irony was bitter beyond words. Condemned for carrying a bastard child she had not conceived, she now faced the possibility that the trauma and cold of her exile had somehow quickened life within her. Whether from shock or divine intervention, or simple biological responses to extreme stress, her monthly bleeding had ceased and her body had begun to change in ways that filled her with both wonder and terror. When she finally found courage to share this development with Bjorn, his response surprised her with its simple acceptance. "A child is a blessing," he said quietly, adding wood to the fire as if her news required no more consideration than the weather. "This one will be welcomed here, whatever the circumstances of its creation." His easy acceptance of what others would surely see as proof of Einar's accusations helped heal something in Alvi's wounded spirit. For the first time since her exile began, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps life might hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Spring arrived late in the northern forests, but when it came, it brought with it the birth of Alvi's first son. The child emerged into the world during a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very mountains, his first cries mingling with the rumble of thunder, as if announcing his arrival to the gods themselves. Bjorn, who had assisted at the birth with steady hands and calm presence, looked down at the squalling infant with wonder in his pale eyes. "He has the voice of a warrior," Bjorn observed, wrapping the baby in soft furs, while Alvi recovered her strength, "and the timing of a poet born with the storm's blessing upon him." They named the boy Eirik, after Alvi's father, though she knew the child would never know his grandfather's craft or blessing. As she held her son for the first time, feeling his tiny fingers curl around hers with surprising strength, Alvi understood that her old life had truly ended. Whatever future lay ahead would be built from this moment forward, in this forest sanctuary, with this gentle giant who had become her protector and friend. The summer that followed proved to be one of quiet healing and growing affection. Bjorn revealed depths of tenderness that belied his fearsome appearance, often singing ancient lullabies to young Eirik in a voice that seemed to make the very trees lean closer to listen. He carved toys from wood with the same patient skill he applied to crafting arrows or mending tools, creating a world of small wonders that spoke of a man who understood the importance of joy in a child's life. Alvi found herself watching Bjorn with increasing appreciation as the months passed. His strength was always tempered with gentleness, his wisdom shared without condescension, and his protection offered without expectation of payment or return. When she struggled with the challenges of new motherhood, he provided support without judgment. When she wept for the family she had lost, he offered comfort without trying to minimize her pain. The moment she realized she loved him came during the harvest season, as they worked together to gather berries and nuts for the coming winter. Bjorn was teaching young Eirik, barely able to toddle, how to identify which plants could feed a family and which might bring harm. The sight of this massive warrior crouched patiently beside a curious child, explaining the secrets of survival with infinite care, filled Alvi's heart with a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. That evening, beside their familiar hearth fire, she found courage to speak of feelings that had grown slowly but surely through months of shared solitude. "Bjorn," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames, "I need you to know that whatever gratitude I owe you for saving my life pales beside the love I have come to feel for the man you are." His response was everything she could have hoped for, and more. Rising from his seat across the fire, he crossed to kneel beside her with movements that were careful rather than hesitant, as if approaching something precious that might be damaged by carelessness. When he took her hands in his massive ones, his touch conveyed both strength and reverence. "I have loved you since the moment I found you dying in the snow," he admitted, his voice roughened by emotion. "But I feared to speak of it, knowing how much you had already lost. If you will have me, not as protector or friend alone, but as husband and father to your children, I would count myself the most blessed of men." They married themselves according to the ancient ways, speaking vows beneath the open sky, with only the forest spirits as witnesses. Bjorn carved wooden rings from the heart of an oak tree, while Alvi wove crowns of summer flowers that filled the clearing with their sweet fragrance. The ceremony was simple but profound, binding them not just in law, but in the deeper commitment of two souls who had chosen each other freely and completely. The first wooden sword appeared the following spring, carved with loving care during the long winter evenings when Eirik had finally grown large enough to hold such a toy safely. Bjorn crafted the weapon with the same attention to detail he brought to his real blades, creating a perfect miniature that balanced properly in small hands and bore the symbolic weight of future training. The sword represented more than play. It was a promise that this child would grow up knowing how to protect himself and those he loved. "A man's worth is not measured by his skill with weapons alone," Bjorn explained to Eirik as the boy wielded his wooden blade with serious concentration. "But in a world that often rewards strength over mercy, a good man must be prepared to fight for what matters most." Their second son arrived during the depths of the following winter, a robust child they named Ragnar for his fierce temperament and strong lungs. From his first breath, the boy seemed determined to match his older brother's energy and exceed it wherever possible. Bjorn greeted this new addition to their family with the same joy he had shown Eirik, carving a second cradle with even more elaborate decorations and spending hours singing the traditional songs that would help the infant learn the rhythm and music of their language. 2 years later, their third son completed the family, a thoughtful child they called Sven for his wise eyes and careful observation of everything around him. Even as a baby, Sven seemed to study the world with an intensity that promised great intelligence, watching his father's movements with the focused attention of one who would learn every lesson offered. As their sons grew from infants to boys, Bjorn began their education in earnest, teaching them not only the skills of survival, but the values that would shape them into men of honor. Each morning brought lessons in woodcraft and tracking, while evenings were devoted to stories that carried within them the wisdom of ages. The boys learned to read the forest's moods, to find food and shelter in any season, and to move through the wilderness with the silent grace of their father. More importantly, they learned the principles that would guide their choices throughout life. Bjorn taught them that true strength protected the weak rather than dominating them, that a man's word once given was sacred beyond all other considerations, and that honor was not something granted by others, but something earned through right action, regardless of who might witness it. Their remote sanctuary became a place where love flourished alongside practical education, where laughter mingled with the serious business of preparing young warriors for an uncertain world. Alvi watched her sons grow strong and confident under Bjorn's patient guidance, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with both skill and character. The years flowed like the stream that ran past their forest dwelling, each season bringing changes that marked the passage of time and the growth of their sons into young men. Eirik, now 15 winters old, stood nearly as tall as his father's shoulder and wielded a real blade with increasing skill. His auburn hair, inherited from his mother, caught the sunlight as he practiced the combat forms Bjorn had taught him, each movement flowing into the next with the fluid grace of a born warrior. Ragnar, at 13, possessed his father's broad build and the kind of fearless temperament that made him charge headlong into any challenge. Whether climbing the tallest trees or wrestling with his brothers beside the stream, he approached life with an enthusiasm that sometimes worried his parents and always entertained them. His wooden practice sword had long since been replaced with steel, though Bjorn still supervised his training with careful attention to both technique and temperament. Sven, the youngest at 11, showed signs of becoming the most thoughtful of the three brothers. While his siblings favored the direct approach to problems, Sven preferred to observe and analyze before acting. He excelled at tracking and woodcraft, often disappearing for hours, only to return with detailed knowledge of every creature and plant within miles of their home. His questions during their evening lessons revealed a mind that grasped not just the practical aspects of their education, but the deeper principles that governed human behavior and natural law. It was during the autumn of Eirik's 15th year that the first trader in many seasons found his way to their remote sanctuary. Olaf Greybeard appeared one morning like a figure from legend, leading a pack horse laden with goods and stories from the wider world. His arrival marked the end of their long isolation and brought with it news that would change everything they had built in the forest's protection. Bjorn Ironshoulder, the old trader said, recognition dawning in his weathered features as he studied their host. "I thought you were dead these 20 years past. There are men in the southern settlements who still speak your name when they tell stories of the greatest warriors they ever knew." Bjorn accepted this recognition with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else, offering Olaf hospitality without acknowledging his former reputation. But Alvi saw something change in her husband's bearing, a subtle tension that spoke of a past he had worked hard to leave behind. Their sons, who had never heard their father described as legendary, listened with wide eyes as Olaf spoke of battles fought and victories won in service of jarls, whose power had risen and fallen like the tides. The trader's pack contained more than goods for trade. It held a worn map that showed the coastlines and settlements of their region, marked with notes about current rulers and political alliances. As Olaf spread the parchment beside their evening fire, pointing out various locations and sharing news of their recent changes, Alvi felt her heart grow cold with a familiar dread. Raven Shollow still thrives under Jarl Einar's rule, Olaf mentioned casually, unaware of the impact his words would have, though the man grows stranger with each passing year. His justice has become harsh beyond necessity, and there are whispers that he sees enemies and conspiracies where none exist. The map showed their old home as a small symbol beside the fjord, impossibly close despite the years and distance that separated them from that life. Alvi found herself staring at the marking with emotions she could not untangle, longing for her parents who might still live there, anger at the injustice that had driven her away, and fear that the past might somehow reach across the wilderness to threaten the family she had built. "What manner of harsh justice?" Bjorn asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Olaf stroked his grey beard thoughtfully before responding. "He has taken to accusing women of adultery and witchcraft on the slightest pretense. 3 have been exiled in the past 5 years, sent into the wilderness to die for crimes that existed mainly in his imagination. The people fear to speak against him, for his warriors remain loyal, and his paranoia grows like a sickness." That night, after Olaf had bedded down in their guest corner and their sons had fallen asleep, Alvi and Bjorn sat beside the dying fire and spoke in whispers of things they had not discussed for many years. The news of Einar's continued cruelty opened old wounds that had never quite healed, reminding them both of the injustice that had driven them together and the innocent women who might still be suffering under his increasingly unstable rule. "The man is a poison that spreads suffering wherever his power reaches," Alvi said quietly, her hands clenched in her lap as she stared into the glowing coals. "How many others have died because no one was strong enough to stand against his lies?" Bjorn's response came slowly, weighted with the wisdom earned through years of contemplation. "Evil flourishes when good men choose comfort over action. I learned that lesson too late in my former life, and I fear I am learning it again now." Their conversation turned to their sons and the choices that lay ahead. The boys had grown strong and skilled under Bjorn's teaching, but they had also grown curious about the world beyond their forest sanctuary. Eirik especially had begun asking questions about other settlements and the possibility of travel, sensing perhaps that his education was nearing completion and that manhood would require him to test himself against challenges greater than forest life could provide. "They deserve to know the truth of their heritage," Alvi said finally, the words carrying weight she had not expected. "Eirik is my son, but he is also the child of a woman wrongly condemned. Ragnar and Sven are the sons of a man whose reputation once commanded respect across all the northern settlements. They should understand what blood flows in their veins and what responsibilities that heritage might bring." The map lay spread between them, its symbols and markings representing a world of possibilities and dangers that their sons had never experienced. Each settlement marked on its surface represented choices they would soon need to make about their family's future and the kind of legacy they wanted to build for the next generation. As the fire burned down to ashes and the forest settled into the deep quiet of night, both parents understood that their time of peaceful isolation was drawing to a close. The boys would soon be men, and men needed purpose beyond survival. The question that remained was whether that purpose would lead them back toward the world that had once betrayed them, or forward into unknown territories where new legends might be born. The spring that followed Olaf's visit brought restlessness that infected the entire family like a fever. The boys had spent the winter months poring over the trader's map, asking endless questions about the settlements marked upon its surface and the kinds of lives men led beyond the forest's boundaries. Their training intensified, as if in preparation for some unspoken challenge, while Alvi found herself caught between protective instincts and the growing certainty that their sons would soon need to find their own paths in the world. It was during the early summer, when the northern sun lingered longest in the sky, that the second messenger arrived. This one came not seeking trade but fleeing pursuit, his horse lathered with sweat and his face marked by the desperate exhaustion of a man who had ridden without rest for days. He bore the signet ring of Jarl Einar's house, though he carried no message of official business. "Sanctuary!" he gasped as he collapsed at the edge of their clearing, his strength finally spent. "I beg sanctuary in the name of justice and the protection of the innocent." The man's name was Hakon, and his story unfolded beside their evening fire, with a weight that made even young Sven's face grow grave with understanding. He had served as one of Einar's trusted advisors for many years, believing his counsel might moderate the Jarl's increasingly harsh decisions. Instead, he had watched helplessly as Einar's paranoia transformed into a madness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing season. 3 days past, he condemned another woman, Hakon revealed, his voice shaking with exhaustion and suppressed emotion. Astrid Whitehair, a widow whose only crime was refusing his advances. He accused her of witchcraft and adultery, claiming she had cursed his livestock and conspired with his enemies. The evidence was fabricated, the witnesses coerced, but none dared speak against his judgment. The signet ring lay on the wooden table between them, its silver surface reflecting the firelight like a fallen star. The ring represented not just Einar's authority, but the system of laws and traditions that should have protected the innocent rather than enabling their persecution. That it now lay abandoned beside their humble hearth spoke volumes about the corruption that had infected Ravenshollow's leadership. Alvi felt the old wound in her heart tear open afresh as she listened to Hakon's account. The parallels to her own experience were too clear to ignore. Another innocent woman, condemned by false accusations, another family destroyed by one man's unchecked power, another tragedy that might have been prevented if someone had possessed the courage to stand against injustice. "Where is she now?" Bjorn asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "Cast out into the wilderness, as you once were," Hakon replied, his eyes finding Alvi's across the fire. "I tried to help her escape before the sentence could be carried out, but Einar's warriors caught us at the village boundary. She insisted I flee rather than die uselessly beside her, and I carry the shame of abandoning her to save my own life." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the fire to settle into glowing embers, while each member of the family wrestled with their own thoughts and emotions. The boys had never heard the full story of their mother's exile, though they understood enough to recognize the parallels in Hakon's tale. Their faces showed the kind of anger that belongs to young men who are discovering that the world contains injustices their strength might address. "We cannot allow this to continue," Eric said finally, his voice carrying the steel that would mark him as a leader among men. "If evil men act without opposition, their evil spreads like poison through everything they touch. Someone must stand for those who cannot protect themselves." Ragnar's agreement was immediate and fierce, his warrior's heart responding to the call of righteous battle. Even thoughtful Sven nodded his support, though his expression suggested he understood the complexities and dangers that such action would entail. They looked to their father with expectation, waiting for the wisdom that had guided their education to show them the proper path forward. Bjorn rose from his seat beside the fire and moved to the wall where his battle gear hung in careful arrangement, relics of a warrior's life he had set aside but never discarded. His massive hands traced the familiar shapes of sword and shield, axe and mail, as if reacquainting himself with old friends he had not seen for too long. When he turned back to face his family, something had changed in his bearing, a transformation from peaceful hermit to the legendary warrior whose name still carried weight in distant settlements. 20 years ago, I chose exile because I was tired of fighting other men's battles for causes that served greed more than justice, he said quietly, each word measured with the weight of long consideration. But this is not another man's battle, this is our battle, for our principles and for the protection of innocent lives. If we do not act, who will? The family council that followed continued deep into the night, as they discussed strategies and possibilities with the careful attention such decisions demanded. Hakon's knowledge of Ravenshollow's current defences and political situation proved invaluable, while Bjorn's tactical experience shaped their planning with the precision of a master craftsman designing a complex project. They would not simply charge into battle like berserkers seeking glorious death. Instead, they would return to Ravenshollow as a family seeking justice. Alvi reclaiming her rightful place as a wronged woman, vindicated by survival and success, Bjorn standing as her husband and protector, and their sons representing the next generation of warriors who would not tolerate corruption in their leaders. "We go not for revenge, but for justice," Alvi declared as their planning session drew toward its close. "We go to end Einar's reign of fear and to ensure that no other innocent woman suffers as I once did. We go to build something better from the ruins of his cruelty." The decision made, they began preparing for a journey that would take them back to the world they had left behind, armed not just with weapons and tactical knowledge, but with the moral authority that comes from having built something good and true in the face of overwhelming adversity. The forest that had sheltered them for 20 years would remain as their sanctuary, but their destiny now lay beyond its boundaries, in the settlement where justice had once failed and must now be restored. The journey to Ravenshollow took them through familiar forests that had changed little in 20 years, though Alvi found herself seeing the landscape through different eyes than those of the frightened girl who had fled through these same woods so long ago. Now she rode beside her warrior husband, her 3 strong sons flanking them like an honor guard, their presence transforming her from exile to returning force of nature. They made camp within sight of the settlement on the evening before their confrontation, choosing a position that allowed them to observe the village's routines while remaining hidden among the pine trees. What they saw confirmed much of what Hakon had told them about the changes that had occurred during their absence. The settlement appeared prosperous but subdued, its people going about their daily tasks with the careful movements of those who had learned to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Eric, whose sharp eyes had inherited both his mother's intelligence and his father's tactical awareness, was the first to spot something that would change everything they thought they understood about their mission. "Mother," he said quietly, pointing toward the great hall where figures moved in the torchlight, "look there, beside the main entrance." Following her son's gesture, Alvi saw a young man whose features made her heart skip with recognition, despite the years that had transformed him from boy to warrior. Magnus, her former betrothed, stood in earnest conversation with several others, his bearing suggesting someone who carried authority within the settlement's hierarchy. But more shocking than his presence was the expression of barely concealed anger that marked his face as he gestured toward the hall where his uncle presumably held court. "That changes our approach considerably," Bjorn observed, his tactical mind already adjusting their plans to account for this unexpected development. "If Magnus has grown to oppose his uncle's rule, we may have allies we had not counted upon." But the greatest revelation was yet to come. As they watched the village's evening routines unfold below them, Sven's keen eyes spotted something that would shatter their understanding of the past completely. Hidden beneath loose stones near the old well, partially concealed by 20 years of accumulated debris, lay a leather pouch that seemed out of place among the settlement's normal detritus. When they retrieved and examined the package under cover of darkness, its contents revealed a truth more devastating than any of them had imagined. The hidden letter, written in Magnus's own hand and dated to the week of their wedding, contained a confession that turned everything Alvi had believed about her exile into a lie built upon lies. The parchment, preserved by its leather wrapping and the dry conditions of its hiding place, told a story of political maneuvering that had used an innocent young woman as a pawn in a larger game. Magnus had discovered his uncle's plan to fabricate charges against Alvi several days before their wedding. Learning that Einar intended to use the false accusations to break the betrothal and arrange a more politically advantageous marriage for his nephew. "I have tried to dissuade Uncle Einar from this course," the letter read in Magnus's careful script, "but his mind is made up. He believes that breaking this betrothal will allow him to ally our family with Jarl Thorson of the Eastern Settlements, whose daughter would bring greater political advantage than Eric's girl. He has already prepared false witnesses and fabricated evidence to support his accusations. I am ashamed to be part of this deception, but I lack the courage to oppose him openly." The letter went on to detail Einar's careful preparation of the charges, including his coaching of witnesses and his arrangement of evidence that would make the accusations seem credible. Most damning of all, it revealed that Einar had known perfectly well that Alvi was innocent of any wrongdoing, making his condemnation a calculated murder attempt designed to eliminate an inconvenient obstacle to his political ambitions. "He plans to claim she died in the wilderness," the confession continued, "and to arrange my marriage to Thorson's daughter before the spring trading season begins. The alliance will strengthen his position among the coastal settlements and provide the military support he believes he needs to expand his territory. I pray that whoever finds this letter will understand that I am a coward, but not a willing participant in innocent blood." The revelation struck Alvi like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that her exile had never been about justice or moral outrage. She had been condemned not for any crime, real or imagined, but simply because her marriage to Magnus had become inconvenient to Einar's larger political schemes. The 20 years of exile, the struggles for survival, the loss of her family and former life, all of it had been sacrificed to one man's ambition and another's cowardice. Bjorn's reaction was quieter but perhaps more dangerous, his calm exterior concealing the cold fury of a warrior who had discovered the true scope of the injustice done to his wife. "This transforms our mission completely," he said, with the measured tone of a man planning war rather than mere confrontation. "We are no longer seeking justice for recent crimes. We are exposing 20 years of deception and holding a murderer accountable for his actions." Their sons' responses varied according to their temperaments. Eric's anger burned cold and tactical, already planning how this revelation could be used to destroy Einar's credibility and power. Ragnar's fury ran hot and immediate, his warrior's code demanding direct action against those who had harmed his family. Sven, true to his thoughtful nature, focused on the broader implications of what they had learned and how it might affect their approach to the confrontation ahead. The letter's existence also raised questions about Magnus's current position and loyalties. Had he remained silent about his uncle's crimes for 20 years, or had he been seeking some way to expose the truth? His apparent opposition to Einar's current policies suggested the latter possibility, offering the potential for alliance with someone who understood the settlement's internal dynamics and possessed legitimate authority to challenge the Jarl's rule. As they planned their approach for the following day, the family found themselves grappling with moral complexities that went beyond simple justice. The letter proved that Alvi's exile had been based on deliberate lies, but it also revealed Magnus as a victim of his uncle's manipulation, trapped between family loyalty and moral conscience. The question of how much responsibility he bore for his silence and complicity would need to be addressed, but not until they had dealt with the primary architect of their suffering. "Tomorrow, we do not merely seek justice," Alvi declared, as they made their final preparations. We expose the truth that has been hidden for 20 years and ensure that every person in Ravenshollow understands exactly what kind of man they have been following. Einar's reign of terror ends not just with his removal from power, but with the complete revelation of his crimes and the vindication of every innocent person he has wronged. The hidden letter had transformed their mission from personal confrontation to moral reckoning, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just their family's future, but the fate of an entire community that had lived under the shadow of a corrupt leader's deceptions for far too long. Dawn broke grey and cold over Ravenshollow, but Alvi felt no chill as she prepared for what would either be vindication or destruction. The village bell that had once called people to celebration would today summon them to witness justice, though they did not yet know it. She stood in the forest's edge, donning her original wedding dress, the crimson gown she had retrieved from her family's old dwelling during their night reconnaissance. The dress fit differently now than it had 20 years ago. Where once it had hung on the slender frame of a hopeful young bride, it now clothed the mature figure of a woman who had borne 3 children and survived hardships that would have broken lesser spirits. The fabric, carefully preserved by her mother's weaving skills, still held its vibrant color despite the years, but now it served as armor rather than ornament, a symbol of promises broken and debts come due. Bjorn helped fasten the ancient tortoise brooches that secured the overdress, his massive fingers surprisingly gentle as they worked with the delicate clasps. Each piece of her ceremonial attire carried weight beyond mere decoration. The silver arm rings spoke of her legitimate status as a free woman, the embroidered patterns told the story of her noble lineage, and the crimson color itself declared her right to stand before the community and demand justice. "You look like a queen preparing for battle," Eirik observed as he checked his own weapons one final time. His comment carried more truth than poetry. Alvi had indeed transformed from exile to sovereign, claiming authority not through birthright, but through the moral power of having survived injustice and built something worthy from its ashes. Their sons had positioned themselves strategically around the village during the pre-dawn hours, each taking a post that would allow them to control key areas when the confrontation began. Ragnar held the approach to the harbour, ensuring that no one could flee by sea or call for outside assistance. Sven watched the forest paths, his knowledge of woodcraft making him invisible to any who might try to escape through the wilderness. Eirik remained closest to the great hall itself, ready to prevent interference from Einar's warriors when the moment of truth arrived. The plan they had developed required precise timing and flawless execution. Rather than simply confronting Einar privately, they had chosen to expose his crimes before the entire community, using the power of public revelation to ensure that truth could not be buried or twisted to serve his purposes. The village bell would be their signal when it rang 3 times in rapid succession. Every person in Ravenshollow would gather in the central square to hear what their former exile had returned to tell them. Magnus, they had learned through careful observation, typically emerged from his dwelling shortly after sunrise to check on the settlement's defences, a routine that would bring him within speaking distance at precisely the right moment. The conversation with him would need to happen quickly and decisively before his uncle could interfere or manipulate the situation to his advantage. Hakon, whose intimate knowledge of the settlement's current politics had proved invaluable, carried with him additional evidence that would support their accusations. Hidden documents and witness testimonies that he had collected during his years of service would provide corroboration for the charges they intended to bring. More importantly, his presence would demonstrate that even Einar's former allies had turned against him when they learned the full scope of his crimes. As the sun climbed higher and the village began stirring to life, Alvi found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years of exile had transformed her from victim to agent of justice, while motherhood had given her stakes worth fighting for beyond mere personal vindication. The woman who would soon confront her destroyer was not the frightened girl who had been cast out, but a force of nature shaped by adversity and tempered by love. The psychological preparation for facing Einar required her to confront memories she had spent years trying to forget. The humiliation of public condemnation, the physical agony of near death in the wilderness, the emotional devastation of losing everything she had believed about her life and future, all of it would need to be faced again, but this time from a position of strength rather than helplessness. Bjorn, sensing her internal struggle, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they made their final preparations. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom earned through decades of warfare and reflection, "you are not the same person who was wronged 20 years ago. You are the woman who survived, who built a family, who raised warriors, and who now returns to claim justice not just for yourself, but for every innocent soul this man has harmed." The moral weight of their mission extended beyond personal vindication to encompass the broader responsibility of protecting their community from continued corruption. Every woman who might face false accusations in the future, every family that might be destroyed by fabricated evidence, every innocent person who might suffer under Einar's paranoid delusions, all of them depended on the success of what they were about to attempt. The final element of their preparation involved the ceremonial aspects that would lend gravity and legitimacy to their accusations. Alvi carried not just Magnus's hidden confession, but also physical evidence of her survival and success tokens from her life in exile that would demonstrate her transformation from victim to victor. The wooden rings Bjorn had carved for their forest wedding, tools crafted by her own hands during their years of self-sufficiency, and most powerfully, the presence of her 3 strong sons who bore witness to her character and worth. As the morning progressed toward the moment of confrontation, each family member performed their final checks and affirmations. Weapons were tested and positioned for easy access, though they hoped that the moral force of their revelation would make violence unnecessary. Escape routes were reviewed in case the situation deteriorated beyond their ability to control. Most importantly, they reminded each other of their ultimate goal, not destruction for its own sake, but the restoration of justice and the protection of future innocence. The village bell stood silent in the morning air, waiting for the hand that would ring it 3 times and summon Ironshoulder's people to witness the reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. Everything they had planned, prepared, and hoped for would soon be tested against the harsh reality of confronting power with truth, corruption with righteousness, and the accumulated lies of decades with the simple but devastating force of revealed fact. Magnus appeared at his usual time, emerging from his dwelling with the bearing of a man carrying heavy responsibilities and heavier doubts. His face showed the lines that came from years of compromising with conscience, the weariness of someone who had watched injustice flourish while feeling powerless to prevent it. When he spotted the familiar figure waiting beside the village, a woman in a crimson dress who should have been 20 years dead, his reaction confirmed everything they had hoped and feared about his role in past events. Recognition dawned in his eyes like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, followed immediately by emotions too complex for simple naming: guilt, relief, fear, and something that might have been hope warred across his features as he approached the woman whose life his silence had helped destroy, and whose return now offered the possibility of redemption he had long believed impossible. The moment of their reunion would determine whether Magnus would stand with them in seeking justice or attempt to protect the uncle whose crimes had shaped his life as surely as they had shaped hers. Everything that followed would flow from the choices made in the next few heartbeats, as past and present converged in a confrontation that would reshape the future of everyone who called Ironshoulder home. Magnus stopped walking as if he had struck an invisible wall, his face draining of color as recognition transformed disbelief into devastating certainty. For a long moment, neither spoke. The man who should have been her husband, studying the woman who should have been dead, while 20 years of guilt and regret passed between them like a physical presence. "Alvi," he whispered finally, her name emerging like a prayer torn from reluctant lips. "You're alive. No thanks to you or your uncle," she replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of a woman who had made peace with her past and chosen to confront it. "But yes, Magnus, I survived. I thrived, and now I have returned to collect what was stolen from me." The village square began filling with curious onlookers as word spread that something extraordinary was unfolding beside the well. Fishermen returning from their morning nets paused to stare at the woman in the crimson dress, whose very presence seemed to charge the air with electricity. Merchants, setting up their stalls, forgot their wares as they recognized features that had haunted their memories for 2 decades. Magnus glanced nervously toward the great hall, where his uncle's throne sat empty but not forgotten. "Alvi, you don't understand what you're walking into. Einar has grown different since you left, dangerous in ways that go beyond mere cruelty. If he sees you here, he will see me," she interrupted, pulling Magnus's hidden confession from beneath her cloak and holding it where he could not mistake its significance. "And he will answer for every lie he told, every life he destroyed, and every day of suffering he caused through his calculated evil." The sight of his own handwriting made Magnus stagger as if struck. His eyes darted from the letter to her face and back again, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise across his weathered features. "You found it. After all these years, you actually found it. Your cowardice preserved itself remarkably well," she observed without malice, though her words carried the weight of absolute judgment. "The question now is whether you will continue hiding behind fear or finally find the courage to stand for truth." Before Magnus could respond, the great hall's massive doors swung open with a crash that echoed across the square like thunder. Jarl Einar emerged, flanked by his personal guard, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with the paranoid intensity that had become his trademark. The silver drinking horn hung at his belt, catching the morning light like a symbol of corrupted authority, while his greying hair and lined face spoke of a man aged by his own cruelties. Einar's gaze found Alvi almost immediately, drawn to the crimson dress that had once adorned his victim and now clothed his nemesis. For an instant his composure cracked completely, revealing the shock terror of a man seeing his past sins given flesh and returned to confront him. Then training reasserted itself, and he straightened into the posture of absolute command that had served him for so many years. "Seize that woman," he commanded, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "She is an exile returned without permission, a criminal who bears false witness against her betters." But his warriors hesitated, caught between ingrained obedience and the obvious impossibility of their jarl's command. The woman before them bore no resemblance to a criminal or exile. She stood clothed in noble finery, flanked by 3 young warriors whose bearing spoke of honor and strength, and backed by the moral authority that comes from having survived impossible odds through righteousness alone. The crowd's murmur grew louder as more villagers gathered, drawn by the unfolding drama and the electric tension that seemed to crackle between the returned exile and the man who had condemned her. Among the faces, Alvi recognized some who had known her parents, others who had attended her wedding, and many who bore the haunted expressions of people who had watched too many innocents suffer under Einar's increasingly arbitrary justice. "People of Ravenshollow," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square and silencing the nervous chatter. "I am Alvi Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the shipwright and Astrid the weaver. 20 years ago, I was condemned by false accusations and sent to die in the wilderness for crimes I never committed. I stand before you now, not seeking revenge, but demanding justice and truth." The silver drinking horn trembled in Einar's grip as he pointed an accusing finger toward her. "You speak lies and sedition. You were justly condemned for adultery, and I speak truth backed by evidence," she interrupted, holding the confession high where all could see. evidence written in your nephew's own hand, detailing how you fabricated charges against an innocent woman to serve your political ambitions. Evidence that proves you knew from the beginning that every accusation was false. The crowd's gasp rippled through the square like wind through wheat, while Einar's face contorted with rage and growing desperation. The throne of power he had occupied for so long was beginning to crack beneath him, and everyone present could sense the shift in authority that was taking place before their very eyes. "Silence her!" Einar roared, his composure shattering completely as the weight of exposure crushed down upon him. "She seeks to destroy order with lies and witchcraft. Kill her before her poison spreads further." Two of his warriors stepped forward, hands moving toward their weapons, but they had barely drawn steel when Bjorn Ironshoulder emerged from the crowd like a force of nature given human form. The giant's presence seemed to fill the entire square, his massive frame casting shadows that reached across the assembled villagers as he took his place beside his wife. The legendary axe that had carved its way through countless battles hung easily in his grip, its familiar weight a comfort after years of peaceful retirement. "Any man who draws blade against my wife draws it against me," Bjorn announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to shout to command attention. "I am Bjorn Ironshoulder, and I claim the right to defend my family's honor against all who would challenge it." The name struck the warriors like a physical blow, causing them to hesitate as recognition dawned in their faces. Even Einar's most loyal followers had heard the stories of Bjorn's legendary prowess in battle, and none appeared eager to test whether age had diminished the skills that had made him famous throughout the northern territories. Their weapons returned slowly to their sheaths as tactical wisdom overruled blind obedience. Magnus stepped forward, his face pale but determined as he finally found the courage that had eluded him for 20 years. "Uncle, the time for deception has ended. I will no longer be silent while innocent blood stains our family's honor. Alvi speaks truth, and I bear witness to every word." "You dare stand against your own blood?" Einar snarled, spittle flying from his lips as rage overcame any pretense of dignity or control. "You betray the hand that fed you, that raised you, that gave you everything you possess." "I stand against injustice," Magnus replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I stand for the honor our family once possessed, before your paranoia and cruelty corrupted everything noble about our name. I should have spoken 20 years ago, and my cowardice has haunted me every day since." At that moment, as if summoned by the power of truth itself, Hakon appeared at the edge of the square. The merchant's balance, he carried a simple set of scales used for weighing goods in trade, had become something far more significant in his weathered hands. The scales of justice, perfectly balanced and gleaming in the morning light, served as a visual reminder that truth could be measured and weighed against lies. "I, too, bear witness," Hakon declared, approaching through the crowd with steady steps. "I have served in Jarl Einar's hall for 15 years, and I have seen how justice has become a tool for personal vendettas rather than protection for the innocent. I carry evidence of his crimes, testimonies from those too frightened to speak, and proof of corruption that reaches into every corner of his administration." The crowd pressed closer as villagers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete exposure of the lies that had shaped their community for decades. Among the faces, Alvi saw dawning understanding as people began connecting current injustices with past atrocities, recognizing patterns of corruption they had been too afraid or unwilling to acknowledge. Einar's isolation became visible as even his most trusted advisors began stepping away from him, their expressions showing the calculation of men who understood when a cause was lost. The silver drinking horn slipped from his trembling fingers, falling to the stone pavement with a ringing crash that seemed to symbolize the collapse of his authority. "The penalty for false witness against the innocent is exile," Alvi declared, her voice carrying across the silent square with the weight of absolute moral authority. The penalty for attempting murder through fabricated charges is death. But I do not come seeking revenge. I come offering the same choice you once forced upon me. Face your crimes with honor, or be cast out to let the gods judge your worthiness to survive. The moment of decision hung suspended like a sword above the square as hundreds of eyes focused on the man who had ruled them through fear for so long. Einar's pale gaze darted wildly from face to face, seeking some sign of support or loyalty that no longer existed. His warriors had abandoned him, his nephew had turned against him, his advisors had fled, and even the common people who had once feared his authority now watched with the calm satisfaction of those witnessing justice finally served. "Choose," Bjorn said quietly, his massive presence lending weight to the ultimatum. "Face judgment from those you have wronged, or take the exile road and discover whether the gods show more mercy than you have shown to others." Einar's answer came not in words, but in desperate action, as he suddenly lunged toward the fallen drinking horn, his hand closing around its familiar weight, as if the symbol of his former power could somehow restore what truth had stripped away. But the gesture was futile, a drowning man grasping at shadows, while the tide of justice swept his kingdom away beneath his feet. The aftermath of Einar's downfall unfolded with the quiet gravity of a community learning to breathe freely after years of oppression. The former Jarl had chosen exile over facing judgment, disappearing into the same wilderness where he had sent so many innocent souls to die. His silver drinking horn lay abandoned in the square where it had fallen, its symbolic power broken along with the corrupt authority it had represented. Within hours of the confrontation, the people of Ravenshollow had begun the process of reshaping their community according to principles of justice and truth, rather than fear and manipulation. The Great Hall, once a place where false accusations echoed from carved rafters, now hosted councils where every voice could be heard and every concern addressed without terror of reprisal. Magnus emerged from the crisis transformed, his 20 years of silent guilt replaced by a determination to rebuild what his uncle's cruelty had destroyed. His first act as the community's chosen leader was to send search parties into the wilderness, seeking any trace of the women who had been exiled on false charges over the years. Though most would never return, the gesture carried symbolic weight that helped heal wounds left by decades of injustice. "I cannot undo the evil that was done in our family's name," he told Alvi as they stood together in the hall where she had once been condemned. "But I can ensure that such evil never takes root here again, and I can spend whatever years remain to me trying to build something worthy of the honor we lost." Alvi accepted his words with the grace of someone who had learned that forgiveness served the forgiver more than the forgiven. The young man who had lacked courage 20 years ago had finally found his strength, and she chose to honor that transformation rather than dwelling on past failures. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibilities for healing and growth. The question of leadership arose naturally as the community grappled with the practical challenges of rebuilding their governance. Many voices called for Alvi to assume the role of Jarl, recognizing in her the moral authority that comes from having survived the worst and emerged stronger. Others looked to Bjorn, whose legendary reputation and obvious wisdom qualified him for any position of responsibility he might choose to accept. But both declined the honor with quiet dignity, understanding that their calling lay elsewhere. They had not returned to rule, but to heal, not to claim power, but to ensure that power would never again be wielded so cruelly against the innocent. Their true victory lay not in political authority, but in the transformation of a community's values and the restoration of justice to a place where it had been long absent. "We have built a good life in the forest," Alvi explained to the assembled villagers when they pressed their offer of leadership. "Our sons have grown strong and wise in that sanctuary, and while we will always consider Ravenshollow part of our hearts, our home lies where we chose to plant our love and raise our family." The decision to divide their time between forest and village satisfied both duty and desire, allowing them to maintain their peaceful sanctuary while remaining available to guide the community's healing process. Their sons, now young men with their own choices to make, elected to stay in Ravenshollow for a time to help with the rebuilding effort and to learn what their mother's original home could teach them about their heritage. Eirik, whose leadership qualities had become apparent during their mission, found himself drawn to the work of establishing new laws and customs that would prevent future corruption. His combination of tactical intelligence and moral clarity made him a natural choice to help design systems of justice that would protect the innocent while maintaining order and stability. Ragnar's warrior spirit found purpose in training the settlement's defenders, teaching them not only fighting techniques, but the principles of honor that should guide the use of force. His enthusiasm for combat was tempered by his father's wisdom about when battles were worth fighting and when strength should be used to protect rather than dominate. Sven, true to his thoughtful nature, dedicated himself to preserving the stories and lessons learned from recent events, ensuring that future generations would understand both the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of moral courage in the face of injustice. His chronicles would become the foundation for a new tradition of accountability that would help prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. As autumn settled over the northern landscape, painting the forests in colors that reminded everyone of life's beautiful impermanence, Alvi found herself standing once again at the crossroads where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The wedding ring Bjorn had carved for her 20 years ago caught the fading light as she traced its simple patterns, remembering the vows they had spoken beneath open sky with only forest spirits as witnesses. The ring had become more than a symbol of their marriage. It represented the choice to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, and to find hope even in the darkest circumstances. As she watched her sons working alongside their new community to create something better than what had come before, she understood that their greatest victory lay not in conquering their enemies, but in refusing to become like them. The woman, who had once been thrown to wolves, had returned with a family of her own, but more importantly, she had returned with the wisdom to help others avoid the fate she had endured. In choosing justice over revenge, truth over vengeance, and healing over destruction, she had transformed not only her own story, but the destiny of everyone who called Ravenshollow home. The future stretched ahead bright with promise, built on foundations of honor, protected by strength tempered with wisdom, and guided by the understanding that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to create something worthy of the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours.